Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 2 of Volume 2 of Rules Bites right here on Myth Brigade. Now, I'm Jason. I'm going to be jawing at you for the next little while about Savage Worlds Adventure Edition from Pinnacle Entertainment. Now, last time we took a trip through character creation. We made ourselves a human character by the name of Earl Parsons. We learned about hindrances, traits, and edges, and how they all work together to make your character pretty special regardless of the setting you're playing in. Now in this episode, we're going to talk about the system's dice and a little something called Bennies. Because if there's one thing that should make you smile like a possum chewing on barbed wire, it's going to be dice and Bennies. I guess that's two things. Say, before we get to that, you ever hear the term wild card? Savage Worlds refers to player characters and select NPCs or monsters as wild cards. Wild cards are considered to be special compared to the nameless masses and receive a couple of benefits in the game. That is, they can take 3 wounds before becoming completely incapacitated, and they get to roll a special 6-sided die called a wild die when making trait rolls. All other NPCs and monsters in the world are pretty much considered to be extras. Extras are considerably weaker than wild cards and can only take a single wound. Now we'll talk a little bit more about this nuance in the combat section, but for now, let's focus on dice. Trait rolls are called for by the GM against an attribute or a skill to determine the outcome of a character's specified action. So this is done by rolling a die corresponding to the die type the character has in that trait. So Earl, who has a D8 in smarts, would roll an 8-sided die when checking smarts. Penalties or bonuses are then applied to get a total, and if the total is equal to or greater than a target number, which in most cases is 4, the attempt is successful. Yeah, it's that simple. If you roll better than a 4, you succeed. Easy tasks are checked with a +2 bonus, average tasks with no modifier, difficult at a -2 penalty, and very difficult at -4. Now beyond that, you're going to want to defer to your GM for the penalty, or maybe some therapy, because...
Well, I don't know what it is, but every time he says something's impossible, I just have to try it.
And how does that usually work out for you?
I always fail.
Now in some situations, a single check requires multiple die rolls. An example of this might be firing an automatic weapon at an enemy. Here, each die is rolled separately, modified for difficulty, and checked for success. Now remember, wild cards get to roll a wild die. This means that they roll a special D6 alongside whatever die is appropriate for the trait and use the higher of the 2 rolls toward their total. Note this is always a choice between one or the other. The dice are never added together. Also, when rolling multiple die checks, only 1 wild die is rolled. Now let's talk about aces. All trait and damage rolls, including the wild die, can ace. This is called an exploding die roll in some systems, and it means if you roll the highest number on a given die, you get to roll that die again and add it to the total. Modifiers are applied after all aces have been added in. So if I rolled 3 aces followed by a 2 on a difficult smarts check, my total would be 26. So 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 2. I then reduce by the -2 for the difficulty for a final roll of 24. Both the trait die and the wild die can ace an unlimited number of times. Our high total here brings us to the concept of raises. Raises gives you a simple way to determine how successful a check was. So for every 4 points above your target number, you get a raise. For a TN of 4, raises would happen at 8, 12, 16, 20, and 24. So my smarts check of 24 would have succeeded and resulted in 5 raises. This means I've not only succeeded, but I've done so to great effect. It's up to the GM to sort out really what that means, but rest assured, a success that profound is going to lead to something great.
I know all the things.
I'm pretty sure that's what they meant. That was definitely a dad joke. So what if an action you're taking is directly opposed by another party? So think of a tug of war or an attempt to sneak while an opponent is actively listening. In these cases, the GM determines the right trait for each side of the check, so maybe sneak versus notice. The character who is acting rolls first. On a success, the opposition rolls and must beat the previous roll's total. If the acting character fails, no opposition roll is needed. Now this saves a lot of time and complexity compared to many opposition systems. Critical failures. Critical failures can happen in a few scenarios. If a wild card rolls snake eyes, or a 1 on both the trait die and the wild die, if an extra rolls a 1 on the trait die, which is their only die, or in the case of a multiple dice check, if a 1 is rolled on the wild die and more than half of the trait dice are 1s. In all cases, critical failures like this lead to a mishap as determined by the GM. A character could drop a weapon, or sprain an ankle when giving chase, or even fall into a bottomless ravine. The worst part? Critical failures cannot be re-rolled using edges or bennies. If you critically fail, you're stuck with it. Next up, we have the concept of unskilled rolls. If allowed by the GM, an action can be attempted even if the character doesn't have the required skill. This check is made at a D4 level and subtracts 2 from the total. Any penalties or bonuses are still applied as usual. GMs note that actions requiring a high level of knowledge or training should just be disallowed as beyond the character's scope. This brings us to rerolls. Some edges and scenarios allow a player to re-roll a trait check. In this case, the player re-rolls all dice, including the wild die, to make a new total. The cool part here is that it doesn't negate the prior result. Instead, the player actually gets to choose which result they want to use, unless the second attempt was a critical failure. In that case, the failure becomes the result, and the GM, he says the bad thing. If multiple rerolls are granted by overlapping edges or bennies, a critical result stops the chain immediately. Last up in the dice department is group rolls. This system is really great for quickly determining a result for large groups of extras attempting to do the same thing or something that's remarkably similar. Here, the GM rolls the appropriate trait die and adds in a wild die, even though they're extras, taking the best of the two as the overall result for the group. Now, GMs, be careful when using a rule like this, where it could cause harm to your PCs. I prefer to limit group actions like this to things like notice or stealth. It also works really well for like athletics or riding, maybe like during a chase scene. Feel free to interpret the results in your own narrative as well. So in a chase scene where a posse's after old Earl, a failed group roll could reduce their number by 1, as a pursuer gets clotheslined by a tree. Always remember, the dice are there to drive the story. It's really up to you to determine what that story is. All right, that covers the dice mechanic on pages 87 through 89. Now let's talk about one of the best concepts in Savage Worlds, and that's bennies. Bennies are tokens that all players get at the beginning of each play session. They may also be awarded for heroic actions, great role play, or saying some shit that really makes everyone laugh.
And then I play my banjo for the chief.
Those playing Savage Worlds in person use physical tokens like poker chips, or bullet casings, or jelly beans, or other items suitable for their setting. More prominent Savage settings may even offer packs of bennies that fit their motif. GMs, if you're looking for a great DIY option, pay your local craft store or hardware store or even the shooting range a visit. You're certain to find something that will do the trick. Game Masters also get bennies, and these come in two forms. First, he or she gets 1 benny for each player character in the session. These serve as a general pool and can be used for any extra or wild card under the GM's control. Each wild card then gets 2 additional bennies plus any afforded by edges or abilities they may have. The GM wildcard can then use these at any time, along with any in the general pool against the PCs. Now, GM wildcards are never awarded bennies for performance, but if they're a recurring character and they survive, they do recharge just like the players. The final way to get bennies is through the action deck, which we'll talk about in detail in the next episode. For now, just remember, if a player draws a joker from the action deck, all players immediately receive a benny. This works the same way for the GM. On a draw of a joker, all enemies and the general pool receive a benny. There are 7 ways to use bennies during play.
Did you just fail a trade roll?
Spending a benny after failing a trait check allows the player to re-roll that check unless it was a critical failure.
Are you shaken?
The spend of a benny removes the shaken condition. This can be done at any time, even if it's not the character's turn. Players, be respectful when inserting a spend into another player's turn, but feel free to tap dance all over the enemy's turn if they've caused you to be shaken.
Don't wanna die?
Bennies can be used to soak damage or prevent wounds from an incoming attack. Doing this requires a soak roll, which we'll talk about in our combat episode. You could jump ahead to page 96 if you're interested in the meantime.
Need to act quickly?
A benny can be spent to allow a character to draw a new action card at any point in combat. This can be done after initiative is settled. That means all action cards are dealt and modifiers from hindrances and edges are applied to those cards. We'll talk a lot more about initiative next time, but for now, just keep this as an option in the back of your head.
How about opening up that can of whoop ass?
Sometimes you just need to hurt the bad guy, but the dice, they're not cooperating. Spending a benny will let you re-roll that so-so damage roll for a shot at something more favorable.
Are you feeling a little low on energy?
Characters who have an arcane background can actually spend a benny to get an immediate 5 power points. This is super helpful in situations where a magic-using character has exhausted all of his or her power, but the battle rages on.
Are you completely confused with where this adventure is going and need a lifeline?
If the GM allows it, you might be able to spend a benny to get a clue, influence an extra, or gain access to items that might help you along the way in your adventure. With all of these uses in mind, it's easy to see that bennies are a super important aspect of the Savage Worlds system. They put some control over the entire game into the player's hands, making things generally more interesting for everyone involved and adding an entirely different layer of decision making to the game. Now, Adventure Editions suggest that you freely award bennies for role-playing hindrances, critical thinking, or other great performances in the session. As action heats up, players will spend their reserves to keep the story interesting and to keep it moving forward quickly. If you're too conservative with benny awards, players might choose to hoard them off to the side and use them only to avoid and remove damage. Of course, if you award too many, the players won't feel the same level of challenge in the game. So try a few approaches across a couple of sessions to see what works best for your players and your campaign. Okay, you are all now up to speed with the Savage Worlds Adventure Edition system for dice, trait checks, and bennies. Next time, we're going to take a deep dive through combat and the system's approach to damage, wounds, and mortality. Thanks as always for spending some time with us here on the channel. Please tap subscribe for more rules bites, table tips, live streaming sessions, and all kinds of other stuff from we nerds here at Myth Brigade. Before we go though, a quick pearl of wisdom from our favorite undead cowboy.
Don't you go asking a barber if you need a haircut.